I knew from day one that Frank wanted to figure out a way to monetize his story and be able to leave a legacy to his kids. And I want to say clearly and categorically, that's always been fine with me. I started reading the book when I realized that there were things in this book that were incorrect. I had to get every single piece of paper I could. I had destroyed a lot of what I had. So I had to get all that back some way. I had to write everything that I had, create new files, read all the transcripts, read stuff that I thought was important and relevant. The Hoffa investigation, which I knew about. I hired investigator Richard Mackow, and Richard was in the FBI for many years. So Richard interviewed people who are referenced in this book, I Heard You Paint Houses. So I'd be in a position to say what I felt I had to say about it, but only after I had the material that I felt I needed to review and be in a position to do this. My name is Glenn Zeitz. 2 N's, not one. I don't want to be cheated. I've been a trial lawyer for over 50 years. This podcast is about my cases and stories of my clients, like Frank Sheeran, the Irishman, who Robert De Niro played in the movie, Vera Koking, who was an elderly widow on Social Security in Atlantic City, where I sued the Trump organization and Trump in 2 different cases, and other clients who I found in my life to be fascinating and interesting people. I'm not going to go over the whole book. I'm just going to go over areas that I think are relevant. So I want to read something in the book, and then I want to tell you about it, and I'll tell you what the real truth is. Here's what Frank says. This is on page 272. About a year later, I was standing in the Cherry Hill Inn in Jersey, getting ready to leave after having a few drinks when my driver, Charlie Ann, leaned over and asked me, quote, "Did you kill Jimmy Hoffa?" I said, "You rat motherfucker." And the FBI came out of the walls to surround Alan to protect him. The restaurant was crawling with agents who had been listening in on Alan's wire. They thought I was going to whack him on the spot. Whenever anybody says, "Did you?" it's time to pick up your check and leave. The only way Charlie Allen asked that particular question at that particular time is that the feds decided it was time he got around to asking it. I had a .38, so while they were surrounding Allen, I ran to my Lincoln and drove up the off-ramp of Route 72, bucking traffic. I got to the branding iron and gave my piece to a woman friend I knew. She put it in her purse. They walked in and she walked right past them and out the door. They asked me to go out the door with them. I did, and one of the agents said they had me for 2 life sentences and 120 years. I said, "Well, how much time do I get off for good behavior?" Agent said that if I wore a wire against Russ, and that refers to Russell Befalino, who I had met one time at Messina, and I'll talk about that someday in the future. 4 attempted murders, a long list of other felonies, and if I didn't cooperate and let them protect me, I'd end up dead from the mob or I'd die in jail. I said, "What will be, will be." And then he goes on. He said, "The way they got me in the first place is they caught Charlie Allen operating a methamphetamine lab in Jersey. Naturally, Allen didn't want Angelo, that's Angelo Bruno, or Russell Bufalino, that's who he's referring to know he was moving meth. Naturally, Allen didn't want to go to jail forever in the meth lab, and naturally, Allen knew the feds would do anything to get me because of the Hoffa case. The feds ended up giving Allen 2 years in jail. But then the state of Louisiana got him for life for baby rape of his stepdaughter. So then he says, I had the RICO indictment against me that named about 20 unindicted co-conspirators, including Russell and Angelo. Angelo was already whacked, that means killed, by the time I'm saying that. By the time the case went to trial, that would be Frank's case. But there were a lot of other important people who did not want to see the government convict me of crimes I allegedly did with them or could be next. Now, a few things. First of all, You heard me before say that Angelo Bruno wasn't killed before Frank's first trial in Philadelphia. He was killed after that trial and before Lou Button's trial that I represented Lou on, and ended up with a sequestered jury on that case because of what happened. So that's one mistake. But I got to give Frank a break, because a lot of times when you look back at time and say things, you can't be 100% accurate. However, this whole episode about what happened in the Cherry Hill Inn and all that took place with the 38 and Alan asking him, "Did you kill Jimmy Hoffa?" All of that is totally false and never occurred. And I should know, because I listened to all the tapes. I listened to Frank's tapes and Lou's tapes and Frank's tape in the second case. I listened to tape after tape. But not only I say this, my investigator, Richard Matkow, interviewed agents who were involved on the cases. And I'm going to start with Agent Henry O. Handy. Now, Henry Handy was the agent who was Alan's handler. That meant that what Handy's responsibility was, and what Handy did, is he had control of Alan. He, for example, would put the wire on, and Handy was basically a person who knew every single thing that went on involving him. And two other agents also were involved. John Tam, you heard me speak of Quinn John Tam in the Baton case. He was in Sheeran's case. And when we get to Ralph Natale and me being in front of the United States Senate twice, you're going to hear about John Tam again. And there's one consistency. John Tam was involved in these cases. I didn't like him. He didn't like me. Frank hated him. And he can speak for himself about how he felt about Frank. But I can tell you right now, he wanted in the worst way to get Frank convicted. And that was just what it was. So Henry Handy was interviewed by Richard Matkow. And I have an interview here that he did on September 4th, 2017. He talked about wearing the wire and the individual I just mentioned, including an agent named Bill McMullen, Jim Moore, John Tam, and Handy himself. He talked about that Alan was in Lewisburg Penitentiary and became a close friend of Jimmy Hoffa there. They played handball together. Alan learned that Tony Provenzano had a beef with Hoffa, and according to Alan, put out an order to have Hoffa hurt in prison. Alan found out about it and told everybody to leave Hoffa alone. He's with me. Alan was stabbed 12 times in one attack because he was protecting Hoffa. This endeared Hoffa to Alan, and he told him that when he gets out, and Alan did get out, to see him in Detroit, and Hoffa gave him $40,000 in cash to get on his feet and introduced him to the Teamsters up and down the East Coast. He also writes in here that Hoffa introduced Alan to Russell Buffalino, who oversaw the Northeast Pennsylvania crime family. He also talked about the possibility that Alan could become a made man. A made man, you have to meet certain criteria. He was half Italian, and they talked about that it should have been or would have been okay for him. But he could never that means make someone a member, Sheeran, because he was all Irish. Now, this is Agent Handy's report. And then he said the following. Handy came to learn from Alan that Sheeran was a big pussy and did not have any stones. Sheeran would never get involved in anything that could get messy. He would call Alan to handle things like that. Then he went on and he talks about the book. And Detective Matkow asked Handy if he had heard of the Charles Brandt book called I Heard You Paint Houses. Handy replied that he read the book and it's pure fiction. Handy stated even the name of the book is fictional and that the mob would never refer to a hit as painting houses. Handy emphatically stated that Sheeran was not involved in the plot to kill Hoffa. Allen told Handy that the Hoffa was killed. He traveled to Detroit, met with a member of a New Jersey mob family. Handy asked Allen that if he ever found out who killed Hoffa, he would tell Allen. Allen told him he would handle it himself. In other words, he would kill anyone who he thought was involved in that. And now I want to get to the passage I read specifically. This is Agent Henry Handy. Mako read a passage to Handy from the Brandt book, which is the Vow of Secrecy, section of the 2016 printing of I Heard You Paint Houses. About a year later, I was standing in Cherry Hill, etc. Goes through the whole passage that I had read here earlier. Henry replied that this event described simply never happened. They wired Allen up using a Nagra. However, they did not use a transmitter to alert them to any potential problems, and they never had a need to protect Allen while he was cooperating, wearing a wire. It continues. I had a 38, so while they were, I ran to my Lincoln and drove up and down the off-ramp, all that. Handy replied that this instance never happened either. It is fiction. Handy stated that Sheeran was never approached to cooperate. Handy also doesn't even know where the branding iron is. And then there's a passage later on where we're going to get to. It says, later on, somebody jumped from behind a bush and threw a blanket over Tam. Blanketing a guy is a message to let him know how vulnerable he is. It startles a guy, and by the time he gets the blanket off, the guy who threw it is long gone. Tam came to court and called me a motherfucker. I just smiled. Handy advised that while he worked with Tam, he never heard anything like this ever happening to him. That's Agent Henry Handy. And with regard to the baby rape, when I get to Ralph Natale, I'm going to go over a whole file that we got. And my investigator in the case back then was, remember, Investigator Russ Collins, the one with the K, Kolins. And he went down. It wasn't in Louisiana. It was in Virginia. And we get to Ralph Natale, who's coming in the next episode. I'm going to talk about what we found out that really happened there. But I'm going to say this at the outset. There was a case in Virginia, and it was a serious case. It was a horrible case. I'm going to talk about what happened. And it was found out that Allen had committed some horrible crimes. And he got 90 years, 45 without parole. It was down in Virginia. And it was well after the cases that I handled and Emmett handled, and well after Frank's case. So nobody, including us, knew about it. But the FBI didn't know about it either. They found out about it later. So Frank was in error when he said that. Somewhere in the book, he says that the FBI knew that before his case. Now, I want to go on. And we also got an interview from Jim Marr. And Jim Marr, and you'll hear more about him later when we get to the Natale case and the appearance in front of the Senate committee, actually appeared in front of the U.S. Senate the day that I was there with Ralph Natale and the day that Nikki Scarfo was there with Bobby Simone. And we're going to talk all about that in the next piece, the next episode. So here's an interview from James Marr that Detective Mako took. This was also on September the 7th, and it's a typewritten report. And he mentions about Marr, that Marr was assigned to organized crime from almost his entire career. From when he first was assigned to OC, that's organized crime, the New York division in 1971. He was one of 4 agents assigned to work with cooperating witness Charlie Allen. He talks about, in his interview, similar things that we already heard Allen talk about with regard to what went on behind the scenes involving the plot to kill Frank Fitzsimmons and others, and then also the Hoffa disappearance, and also a sit-down that's referenced in the book, in which I've talked about. Then he mentions Ralph Natale. He talks about he arrested Ralph Natale on a DEA buy bus warrant in Fort Lauderdale. And then it says here Natali immediately clammed up when he realized Allen had set him up, and he would not, meaning Natali, cooperate. And he says Natali was later convicted, in this case, and sentenced to more than 16 years in jail. And Frank Sheeran was arrested just before or after Natali's arrest. Marr was seeking Natali's cooperation on a major Philadelphia division case called Gangplank, which targeted the leadership of Angelo Bruno. And then he goes on talking about the case about a Frank Narducci who was killed. He believes that he may have been there at the Senate hearing when Charlie testified. Marr also testified in these hearings. He wasn't sure if it was the same day. Well, I was there, and I remember Jim Marr. And then he has Nicky Scarfo also testify. So that's correct also. And if I read something that was incorrect, that the FBI, that the agents who were FBI agents say, I'm going to call a spade a spade. I'm going to call it like it is. And there's something I have to talk about when I'm done reading these reports, which I will, where I differ with the agents. And I have an issue I want to raise, and I'm going to do it. Then he read the passage about the Cherry Hill incident, where Allen says, did you kill Jimmy Hoffa? And he says, quote, Marr listened to the passage and stated that this incident described in the book never happened while working with Charlie Allen. Then he went to the second part, running to the Lincoln and going off the airframe and bucking traffic and the branding iron and that whole part. And he says, this incident never happened either. It's fiction. Then he mentioned the blanketing thing. He says that didn't happen. And then he goes to the term, I heard you paint houses, being referred to as a hit, which Marr never read. He never read the book. He said this term was never used by anyone in LCN, that's La Cosa Nostra, when referring to killing somebody. It's just not real or believable at all. Also, that Frank Sheeran did not kill Jimmy Hoffa either. He says it doesn't make any sense that he would do a high-profile hit. It would have to be a made guy or someone who took the job to be made. He said he characterized Sheeran as nothing more than a union thug and not a hitman. And then he talked about the crazy Joey Gallo killing and murder. And these agents debunked him, Marr, and others, what happened there. And now we'll get to my not-so-favorite agent, Quinn John Tam. At some point, I'm going to invite him to give his version of things because we both are now many years older. And I know what it was like back then. And when I get to Natali, wait till you hear what I have to tell you that he did in Natali's case that you'll hear next. Something that I've never seen before in my entire life and never saw since as a criminal lawyer with thousands of cases. And you're going to hear, when you hear this one, it's an interesting story. So he interviewed on the 9th of September, 2017, Quinn John Tam Jr. And he read to him the passage about what happened in the bar when Allen said, did you kill Jimmy Hoffa? And then Tam says, quote, Tam stated that during the time that Charlie Allen was wired up, Sheeran, they never had a discussion regarding the murder or disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa. And he talks about some other people. And he said that he believes that Allen was motivated to cooperate in part because he wanted to get vengeance for the killing of Jimmy Hoffa. So that by cooperating in whatever way he was doing, that's what Tam felt was the motivation. And think about it for a minute. If you're going to get somebody to admit they had something to do with the Jimmy Hoffa disappearance, are you going to ask the following question? Did you kill Jimmy Hoffa? That's not going to all of a sudden it's like a 9 fire alarm. Did you kill someone? That's not how they operate. And I have something I'm going to talk about shortly. It involves the last tape and a so-called malfunction. And I have a transcript here. I'm going to read to you when I get done with this. I don't want anybody thinking that, I'm an FBI guy. I'm a guy who all my life, I fought the government, fought, you know, agents. And there were honest ones, plenty of honest ones. There's some that are overzealous. Sometimes a lot of criminal lawyers get indicted and they go to jail because they're overzealous. Your obligation is to be zealous within the bounds of the law. So we're not supposed to step out of bounds. They're not supposed to step out of bounds. And when they do, I'll tell you what I call it. I have a word for it I've used in courtrooms over my lifetime. I call it skullduggery. And skullduggery is when you go into the graveyard and you dig up stuff. So I'm not adverse to calling a spade and accusing the government of misconduct or suing them in civil rights cases. But if they're telling the truth in something like this, and I know what the truth is, and I know which side the truth is on, then I'm going to acknowledge that and let the chips fall where they may. Now, Tam goes on, talks about the branding iron. Here's what he says. This passage is fiction. It never happened. And Sheeran was never confronted like this. And he goes on to say it never happened. And he went on to talk about the blanket. And so he supposedly was blanketed. He said that never happened. I do remember one thing that's like on a funny note. I remember seeing Frank at his apartment. He said he thought he heard an agent fall out of a tree, that the agent may have been in a tree trying to listen or something, you know? That cracked me up. So Tam also talked about Emmett Fitzpatrick and that Emmett was supposed to receive a certain amount of money, 30 grand for the trial, but it lasted a lot longer. And that was an explanation possibly of why I think what Emmett wanted was more money to catch up for what he lost in the first case. And by doing that, when Frank made his final decision, he had to pick between Emmett and me, he decided to pick me. So anyway, then he talked about in the second RICO case, he got an attorney named Glenn Zeitz. And then he mentioned that they had an additional witness in that case named Bobby Rispo, who was very good. And I mentioned him before. And I have to admit, he was a good witness. Because if it was Alan alone with tapes, it would have been a little bit of an easier case. But when you add a second witness on tape in a different area, but connected to the case, you know, it bolstered their case. You know, my argument as a lawyer was that one guy's lying, the other one's swearing to it. But the jury chose to believe the government's case. So he mentioned that, and then he mentioned the part that I told you about before that hurt the case, in my opinion. Tam stated the evidence also included the Gene Hoffa leasing scam material. There were tape discussions that corroborated this. At one point on a tape, in response to a question by Charlie Allen, Sheeran said something to the effect of either fuck my union or to hell with my union, and this was played for the jury. Sheeran also took the stand in his defense, and he talked about that. If you recall, I said that portion, when that was played, and it wasn't, he didn't use the word fuck my union, it was to hell with my union. Frank really was a good union man, but in the context of that question and answer, he said something that was very damaging. And what the government does in these tape cases, they bring these tapes in, and they got recording devices, and they pick up the tapes. And then they prepare transcripts, and you have to listen to the tapes. And I think I went through this. And you fight over what was said, particularly in a case where Frank stuttered sometimes. But ultimately, what they do in a lot of their cases, they play the tapes. They walk up in front of the jury and they say, tapes don't lie. And, you know, there you are on tape. So from that, I'll tell you what I started doing later on with clients. I would tell my clients, we're going to write something on a sticker. I want you to put it on your refrigerator. It's going to say the following: silence is a true friend that will never betray you. You put that on your refrigerator, and every day you read it and think about it, because you've got to keep your mouth shut. Because what happens is people through their own mouth end up saying something, and then they end up giving the government their head on a silver platter. And you're told you have the right to remain silent, but people have a natural desire to talk and let it out. And there was a book that I read in college by Dostoevsky. It was called Crime and Punishment. I think I had to read it for a sociology class or something. And I read the whole book. And what happens is there's a character in the book named Raskolnikov. And he's being investigated, and it's in Russian. It's Russian. He's being investigated for a murder. And they track him down. They chase him for like years after year. And the book is about all the things that are going on to try to trap him or get him. Finally, after I don't know how many years, because it's so long ago I read this book, which is a classic, he can't take it any longer. And he actually comes in. And that's how the book ends, when he confesses to the investigator. So basically, Tam echoes Mar, echoes Handy, and they were all interviewed within a handful of days of one another by an investigator who I hired. And I certainly didn't hire him with any preconceived notions, but knowing myself what the truth was. And then he's asked about the title. Here's what he said about that. Tam was specifically asked if he had ever heard the term, "I heard you paint houses," being referred to as a hit or a contract murder. Tam replied he has never heard this term being used in this context. Tam has heard various terms that would apply to having a person murdered. They include putting a hit on, whack, do some business, make him disappear, when referring to killing someone. And if somebody's already been murdered, then the phase is he's gone. There's also something I learned during this time. I can't remember specifically if it was from Frank or who it was from. And you're going to love this one. Somebody said to me, "Blame it on a dead guy. Blame it on a dead guy." Now, I want to get into the last tape, because I know, and hopefully everybody knows, that this never happened. But here's where I take issue with the government. Here's a folder. I call it the last tape. Here's why. The information that I had, and here's a transcript. This transcript is dated October 21, 1981, and involved the case involving the federal case involving the Boffas and also Frank in federal court. And they have a hearing that you go through in federal court, which is pretty much uniform. It's called a Starks hearing, Starks. Starks hearing is a hearing on a number of issues that the government has to satisfy in order to get tapes admitted into evidence. Portability issues, it could be chain of custody, the language. Sometimes, like I mentioned before, you differ in terms of what was said. And the defense, if they have a legitimate basis to prepare a transcript that changes the words a little bit, they have a right to do that. I felt that some skullduggery may have occurred with regard to the last tape or tapes. So I want to read to you a little bit of the transcript. And this was a hearing in front of Judge James Latcham, Chief Judge of the United States District Court. And one other thing, if there's something in this book, which we can still get to because there's a few other areas I want to talk about, where there's a reference made to something that happened, this judge wrote an opinion, a written opinion, every time he made a major decision in the case. And there's one or two other areas in this book I want to talk about that relate to that. So here's some yellow underlining. I want to just read to you some questions and answers. So I'm reading from a transcript under oath in front of the federal court where everybody's present. This is of Handy. You were, and Special Agent John Tam were the agents who supervised Mr. Allen's activities during the course of this investigation. Answer, yes, sir. Him and Tam. Were you the agents who personally, on several occasions, placed a body recorder on Mr. Allen's body? Yes, sir. Now, what happened is this, and here's what he's asked about now. And when you had those conversations with the alcohol and tobacco and firearm people, he told them about his confidential informant status relationship with you. Isn't that true? Yes. And is it also true that by him doing that, he compromised the integrity of your relationship as a confidential informant? Answer: he compromised the confidential relationship that we had, telling someone outside the FBI that he was working for the FBI. So what happened was, he was working as an informant for the FBI. And the way the rules work, you're not supposed to let anybody know, including another agency, your status. And that blew up. Now he's admitting that, and I knew that. And he admitted something we all knew. And I'm the one asking these questions, okay? Then we go on. Now, he began these tapes around October, and they ran into February. Now, I want you to hear the questions and answers, and then we'll talk about it in a little bit. I'm going to talk about it. All right? Now, the last tape that we have here is a tape that is dated February 3, 1979. Isn't that correct? Answer: that's correct. And that is a tape, is it not, of a purported conversation between Mr. Allen and Mr. Sheeran? Answer: that's correct. The previous tape is one that's February 2, 79. Isn't that correct? That's correct. And that is a tape recording purportedly of a conversation of Eugene Hoffa and Charlie Allen only. Isn't that correct? Answer: that's correct. Now, here's where things start happening. And the waters get a little muddy. Now, isn't it true that Mr. Allen made at least one more tape after February 3, 1979 tape? Answer: as I recall, the last tape was made the 8th. I'm not sure. February 5th, wasn't it? Was it? I'm not sure what date it was. Now, then I asked the question, well, which would be after? Would it not the very last date of the tapes before you, the ones dated the 3rd? If he made one on the, then he says, this one's dated the 3rd. If he made one on the 5th, that would, and then he stops and he says, right. Isn't it true that was Mr. Allen's last tape before he surfaced? And he says, which one are we talking about? I say February 2nd, the February 5th tape. If that's the last tape, I don't recall the exact date. All right, then we go back to the following. How many tapes did Mr. Allen make during the time period that he was tape recording conversations? Answer: approximately 90. And out of the 90 tapes, isn't it true there was only a malfunction on one tape? Answer: there was a malfunction, as I recall, on 2 tapes. Well, perhaps, this is my question, well, perhaps when I use the term malfunction, I'm confusing you. There was one tape, was there not, where the tape continued to run? Answer: that's correct. When he went to turn the remote switch off, it kept running, and I regard that as a malfunction. I say, okay, forget about that one. He goes, okay. Now, just so you understand what a remote switch is, there was a switch that he had because the tape could only run so long. So basically what happens is he has a remote switch and he can turn it off so he doesn't run out of tape. Now, here's what happens. I say, forget about that one. He goes, okay. Then I go on to talk and ask him the following. There was only one other malfunction then, correct? Yes, sir. And that was a malfunction with the equipment. Isn't that correct? He said it was probably my error more so than the equipment. And that one malfunction occurred on the very last day that Mr. Allen was recording on February 5th. Isn't that correct? Answer: I'm not sure. I think we were, after the malfunction we did, in fact, have another recording. What I was trying to get to is the last tape, because I know what I believe based on the argument I was making and having spoken to Frank. He says, it's been a while since I reviewed these dates, Mr. Zeitz, but I do remember them, date that we had a malfunction. It's my understanding we did have another tape after the malfunction. I recall the malfunction very well. And then I go again, do you recall this question and answer? On the 5th day of February, was that the date the malfunction occurred? Answer, yes, sir. Question, is that the only malfunction that you recall? He says, answer, well, yes. All right, so let me stop beating maybe a dead horse and tell you what this is really all about. There came a point in time in this investigation when Charlie Allen said something to Frank, and that's when Frank realized that he was an informant. And this is not the way it happened. They didn't have him ask a stupid question like this, did you kill Jimmy Hoffa? What happened was there was a name, and there was a name that was mentioned by Charlie Allen to Frank. And I know the name that was mentioned. And when Frank heard that name, he knew at that point in time that Allen was, in Frank's words, a rat motherfucker, to use Frank's words. And what happened then is Frank said, based on what I was arguing, I don't know what the fuck you're talking about. There's no tape ever where that was recorded. Now, we argued, and I was arguing that if it was said, basically, would have been an exculpatory statement. There's no tape where that's anywhere to be found. Now, did Frank actually say it? I don't know. I wasn't there. I just know the following. At the very end, there was some kind of malfunction that occurred. And because the way I remember it being told to me is that when they were together, Frank said something, and when he said what he said, they came running in and they took him away. And one other thing I want to add, because you know about Allen's plea agreement, which I have right here, sweetheart of a deal. Let me tell you what they did, so you know what the government did. They were concerned about Allen to continue with a lawyer that he had at that time, Sal Avina. Sal was representing Allen initially in the case that he had. So what they did, they went to court and they had what's called an ex parte hearing on the record. And they got Allen a court-appointed lawyer. And they picked someone who they felt they could trust 110%. J. Clayton Underkoffler III, who was the first assistant, which is the highest level other than the actual U.S. attorney for the Eastern District in the U.S. Attorney's Office. And he became Allen's lawyer. So Salavina, while he was representing Allen, didn't know that his client was wearing a wire for 90 or so sessions. So now you should know why me, Glenn Zeitz, from the young age of 32 to now, always had to presume when you talk to somebody that they could be tape recording your conversation. And that's the world of paranoia. If you're going to represent criminal cases and certain types of cases, not just mob cases, drug cases, smugglers. I could name all kinds of cases I've had. I'll be talking about at some point in time in this podcast down the road. You have to be that way. You have to be very careful. And you want your clients to be careful about what they say, not in a way to obstruct justice, but if they're indicted, they shouldn't be talking to anybody other than a lawyer and someone who's acting on their behalf. So he was the one who negotiated this beautiful plea agreement for Allen for a sentence not to exceed 7 years. That Frank continued to yell about, scream about the way in which they went about to prosecute him and get him. So now I want to go to another area of the book. Okay, then Frank talks about, and this is in page 275. This would be his the Delaware case. He says, the other big problem I had was the FBI took down the license plate number for my black Lincoln that I had in Detroit when Jimmy disappeared. The feds found out that I bought the car from Eugene Hoffa. Excuse me, this was the case that, the federal case that I handled. Then he talks about the Lincoln and talks about Tam and how he beat that case. Talks about the crane company problem. This is on page 274. He says, my big problem is a couple of smaller offenses. They had my voice on the wire that Charlie Allen was wearing when he was on the payroll, Local 326. I had a problem with a crane company. And he talks about two of the shop stewards, where the manager fired two of them. They claim I told Charlie Allen to give a guy a tune-up. Allen had me on tape saying, break both of his legs. I want him laid up. I want him to go to the hospital. He talked about putting a fake cast on, and he talks about the following. And this is now on back to 275. Agent John Tam got the last laugh. This was after he beat the first case. He said, I had more lives than a cat until now. I was 62 and I got 18 on top of the 14 for 32. I had bad arthritis and looked like I would die in jail. I did my federal time first. I spent the Reagan years as the president's guest. He talks about being sent to Sandstone. And he did write a letter to Reagan. So then he goes on. This is on 277. By 1991, I needed surgery. I would become paralyzed, so they let me out on early parole and a medical hardship. Then basically, you go to the following. And this deals with the title of the book. You heard what happened in Lou Batone's case. And in Lou Batone's case, if you remember, Charlie Allen asked him, so remember we killed that guy, Marie? And he goes, yeah, but, and I explained that, the context of that, the inclusive, exclusive we meaning two other people that you heard or something like that versus we meaning you and that other person. And he went, yeah, I've represented a lot of guys. And I've been in rooms with Frank at dinner where someone else was saying something or talking, or maybe even me. And what Frank would do, go, yeah. And I knew what that meant. I hear you. Doesn't mean I agree with you. Doesn't mean I adopt what you have to say. It's basically a polite way of telling you, not get lost. So here's what it says on page 286. Talks about how the camera died. This was the camera where he was videoing Frank. He stopped the tape from time to time and turned on an audio tape recorder. I still had ample material was recorded. In reviewing the recordings, both audio and video, there were a number of segments that are revealing of the man himself and some of his deeds. Then he gets down to this at the very end of that page. He says, looking at the cover of the book, he said, that's Frank, I think the title sucks. That sounds like Frank. I said, but they're the first words that Jimmy ever spoke to you, right? Then he has in quotes, yeah. Then he admitted and dropped that topic. And then he says, while he was looking at a photo of Sal Bergoglio, I mentioned that we would be following our plan to urge the FBI to release their file so that whatever Sally Bugs had told them would corroborate the book. I said the photo was taken before you took care of him. You know what I mean? And he answers, yeah, he said. And he says, did that picture of Sally Bugs stir up anything in you? I asked. No, not really, he said. Water under the dam. I told him that if he got well, enough Eric Sean wanted to take us for a lunch at Monty's restaurant in Brooklyn where he had picked up the package. Yeah, he said, the package, yeah, for the Dallas. I'm going to stop right there. Now, I know Eric Sean of Fox, and he did Riddle, and he came here, and we did a story and a video, and he's devoted a big chunk of Fox time and effort to this case, and so did Dan Moldea. I want to read something to you. This is page 2736. This is from Frank Sheeran being questioned. And this is when Frank was on the stand, and there was a recording. And here's the question. This is under oath, and I'll give you Frank's answer. Do you remember hearing Charlie Allen bring that statement up on the conversation? And it was referring to a statement that he had made that follows up. And his answer is, I don't care. He brings a lot of things up on conversations, but that doesn't make it right. Half the time I would say, yeah, and that's in quotes, to get him off my back. He could have brought that up in a conversation while I had some Gatorade juice. Gatorade juice is booze. This is Frank under oath, testifying about a specific area. When I say yeah to get him off my back, that was my experience with Frank. It was just the way he was in many instances. So for some reason, he didn't like the title. And you heard what the agent said about, I heard you paint houses. And I never heard that before in my entire life. And I have read probably thousands of pages now of FBI 302 reports, DEA 6s. And then I've also had informant reports with varied, you get an informant report, and then tapes and transcripts. Never heard that before in my entire life either. And then I have a letter here, which I'm going to get to. And this is an area of the book now, which starts at 309, stories that could not be told before. And on page 318, the writer, Charles Brandt, says, bottom line, I kept the details of my role out of the book because I didn't want anybody, especially not Billy, to get a big dose of me being not happy with Charlie. Our family motto was, when in doubt, leave it out. So he goes right to 1991. And he says, in addition to leaving out my role and my tactics as an interrogator from March 1, 1999 to December 14, 2003, nearly 5 years, I also left out the details of my earlier time with Frank in 1991. Okay, so I'm almost done going through the book. It talks about on the following page, let's see, one advantage I thought I had was the firm way I handled Sheeran 10 years earlier in 1981. Right after Frank had beaten his RICO trial in Philly, he engaged me to represent him in Wilmington on his labor racketeering charges in federal court. I stood with him at his arraignment. We entered pleas of not guilty. There were a half a dozen mafia co-defendants, led by Genovese capo Tony Provenzano's man, Eugene Boffitt, and including Bobby Risco of the Philadelphia family. I referred to the lawyers the following. These would be, all Philly lawyers. Each had an opulent big city lawyer, men with diamond cufflinks and monograms on their starched white shirts. In the hallway after the arraignment, Frank took me aside and said, I like the way you handle yourself and all that. I'm not going to read all the words. Frank said, basically, those other lawyers are going to file things, and you don't need to do all that paperwork. They'll put things together, just sign your name. And then he tells him he's not going to do it. And he basically tells him that once he quoted a fee, once an issue arises about his fee, he's done. I won't represent you or negotiate with you. I'm sure you can find another way to do it the way you like it done. But what you propose is not how I work and on behalf of my clients. When I prepare motions for a client, I know whose side I'm on. I have no idea whose side any of these people are on. And then he goes on to say, before he could answer, I turned and left. Before he could answer, I turned and left. As if to prove my point, a month later, the U.S. attorney revealed that the Philly guy, Bobby Rispo, had turned government informant months earlier. Risco was a man on a wire the whole time. This group of lawyers met with all their clients to discuss strategy with the government, listening in. It sounded unconstitutional to me, an invasion of the attorney-client relationship, but it was upheld in a reported decision, United States versus Hoffa. Ultimately, Frank was convicted and got 18 of his 32 years on these charges. I was sure Frank remembered all that when he decided to hire me to get him out on medical parole. All right, now, 18 of those I own, and 6 he did. 14, in addition to that, somebody has to own. Tom Little, who tried the case and he got convicted, or Charlie Brandt, who handled the appeal and lost. Someone can own that. But here's the part that is wrong. He talks about months earlier. This would have been before the arraignment. This didn't happen. It didn't happen before the arraignment. It happened a few months later, towards the end of the year, when Quinn John Tam came into court and disclosed to us, myself and the other lawyers, that Mr. Rispo had become a witness for the government. And then we had protracted hearings, and I'm the one that conducted most of the questioning of the agents, including Agent Tam, about this whole topic. And the judge wrote an opinion and found that there was no invasion of the attorney-client relationship because there was nothing that was discussed during that time period that could be used because we did not discuss with him or his lawyer at that time anything that would be used against people in the case. So whatever prediction that he made, that's not the way it worked out. And one other thing about the arraignment. When I mentioned that there were thousands of documents in those 5 boxes, this was one that was included. And because I'm obsessively compulsive, I read every single piece of paper. And I want to read this letter. This is a letter, and it's dated July 17, 1980. It's from F. Emmett Fitzpatrick to the Honorable James L. Latcham, that was the judge, Ray Francis Sheeran. Dear Judge Latcham, in the past, I have represented Mr. Sheeran, and he has indicated a desire to have me represent him in a matter presently pending in your court in Wilmington, Delaware. I intend to seek the court's permission to allow me to represent Mr. Sheeran in your court, and I suppose the most appropriate time for me to do that would be at his arraignment. And if you remember, I told you that Emmett, just like me and the other lawyers, we had to get a Delaware lawyer to come in and move for us pro hoc vici. Here's the next paragraph. This is Emmett. I said it was a 2-horse race between me and Emmett on who was going to end up representing Frank Sheeran. Here's the next paragraph. He is unofficially informed by the strike force here in Philadelphia, who was acting as prosecutor in this case, that the arraignment is scheduled for Wednesday, July 23rd. Mr. Sheeran had on a prior occasion made arrangements to take his daughter to enroll her in college in upstate Pennsylvania on that day. While he recognizes the importance of the appearance before the court, he has asked me to determine if it could be rescheduled until Wednesday, July 30th, with relatively minor inconvenience. Next paragraph. I have discussed this matter with Assistant United States Attorney Ed Levitt of the strike force here in Philadelphia, and he has no objection to me, Mr. Sheeran, being permitted to be arraigned on the 30th. I am hereby requesting this extension from the court with copies to the United States Attorney and the Clerk of Court, F. Emmett Fitzpatrick. There was an arraignment, and I certainly wasn't there at that point yet, and neither was Emmett. So whatever happened there, and I wasn't privy to this, between Frank and Charlie, I can't speak for. I do know the following, that I became Frank's lawyer shortly thereafter. And Frank and I met at the rickshaw, and he paid me the money, the 10 grand in cash, like I said, and I became his lawyer. So there may have been something behind the scenes. If I had to guess, then maybe, Emmett needed somebody. He needed somebody to move for his admission. And with regard to one last thing I want to talk about is filing motions and other lawyers doing it. You're allowed to join in the motions of the other lawyers if they're motions that can apply and help you. And the court doesn't want to read like 8 of the same thing. So you can file something that you join in as long as you feel it advances your client's rights. But you're not going to compromise their rights. And that's how we ended up with a severance. If I told you before, we ended up with a severance because I felt and Frank felt, and so the other side, we couldn't get a fair trial if we all were tried together. It took multiple motions to be able to do that. And then he goes on to say, this is on page 321. This is, talks about him and Frank. Frank, and this is quoted, I said, you're in a wheelchair. Bart and I are medical malpractice lawyers. That's all we do now. Well, I got to confess, I've had a lot of cases, but I'm not a medical malpractice lawyer. In fact, I do represent doctors. I've represented doctors in criminal cases where they've been indicted. I've represented doctors many times when they've had medical board issues and professionals. And in my website, you'll see that. That's a subspecialty of me. When I represent the doctors, I'm not suing them. I'm representing them in criminal matters or board matters involving their licenses. Frank says the following. This is on page 328 of the book. Quote, people don't think the FBI knows what the fuck they're doing. The FBI knows what the fuck they're doing. That, for the most part, is a true statement. But my job as a lawyer is to try to figure out if there's something where they did something wrong, either deliberately, accidentally, whatever. Talk about a tape malfunction in a case like this. It's something important. And what was said, and I know there was a name that was mentioned. And in a later episode, when I talk more about this and I talk about who I believe killed Jimmy Hoffa and where the body is, I'm going to discuss those things. Right now, I just want to finish with this book. Then he talks about Bob Garrity. We interviewed Bob Garrity, walked away from what was said. And then there's La Veranda. I already spoke to something about La Veranda and where we would sit and how careful we had to be because people were getting killed. And Frank, as I said before, had a problem too. Anybody who was in this world or arena could have had a potential problem when something like this happens. And then he talks about, and this I'm trying to figure out if it was just bad language. He talks about Bobby Marino and the Marino case. He says that Frank told me 2 anecdotes that illustrated their relationship. And this deals with his relationship with Russell Buffalino. I met Russell one time. I met him at the Messina Club around 11th and Tasker in Philly. It's almost like a speakeasy. It was owned by Tut. Tut was there behind the bar, and they still have, last time I looked, it's a club, a private club. They had that round table. And it was like a speakeasy. You could see through the little peephole or whatever it was. And you didn't get into that place unless they wanted you in there and you were allowed in there. And there were 4 people at that table. It was Frank, me, Russell Buffalino, and Russell's lawyer, Charlie Gelso. And where we sat was, I was, like if I'm in the chair here around the round table, Russell was to my immediate right. And then it was Frank and then Charlie next to me. So I could talk to Charlie, the lawyer, and have like lawyer talk. Russell could talk to Frank, and then we could all talk together. And my law assistant, I remember telling him, I'm going to this meeting. And Russell was out of prison at that time. And there was a period of time he was out, and then he ended up with another problem and had to go and ended up back in again. And I have a ballpark figure of when this occurred, and I'm going to talk about this right now, briefly. And then I could talk about it more extensively later. So anyway, one of the things I was told by Frank is if I have spaghetti or anything like that, do not cut it with a knife, twirl it. He also told me Russell liked peas. And if he orders peas, that hopefully he's going to enjoy whatever he's eating. There was one waiter. So we talked for a number of hours. And at a later time, I'm going to get into that. But here's a picture. This is taken late in life of Russell in a wheelchair and Frank. And in this picture, you can see all the weight that Frank lost. Russell and Frank both were what they call stand-up guys. They did what they did. They didn't say or do anything that hurt anybody else. And they honored the code that they believed in. Now, I want to finish with the Marina thing. He talks about Big Bobby Marino, the 300-pound hustler. Frank was acquitted of murdering in his 1980 RICO trial. Russell had ordered Frank to do the hit without realizing that Marino was doing some loan sharking for Angelo Bruno. After the hit, it was revealed that Marino had $80,000 of Angelo's money, that's Angelo Bruno's money, in loans on the street. No one but Marino knew to whom he had lent any of the money. That $80,000 down the drain, it appeared to be Frank's fault. Frank was called in by Ange, that's Angelo Bruno, to explain himself. He took the rep and never once mentioned that Russell had ordered the hit. And then, quote, this is, Brandy says, quote, this is Frank saying, I didn't want to embarrass Russell, Frank told me, for moving ahead with the thing without checking with the people. Russ did try to call it off. It was too late. I was already on my way. Now, when he says I was already on my way, if that would lead a reader to believe in any way that he was on his way and he was going to kill Marino, that's not what happened. No, what happened was, and he got acquitted, the proof was, and Charlie Allen testified that he was ordered and he followed Frank's order and he's the one that killed Marino. And he testified to that in court. So I want to clarify that because you heard what was in the appeal that they found was the record in that case. And Brand handled that appeal. And it referenced that case. And Allen taking orders from Frank. So here's the bottom line, the way I see it. Pretty much the way things were set up and described in the book, there were hits and murders that Frank committed, multiple ones. I can tell you the following. Any of the evidence, anything that I saw over the years, nowhere did I see or hear that he himself ever killed anyone. Did he hire Allen to do things? Yes. It's in the record. Is Allen a liar and a perjurer on occasion? Yes. It's a way to survive out there. Allen be the first one. He admitted it under oath when I asked him in multiple trials about lying. So he's an admitted perjurer and liar. And I'm going to have a lot to say about that in the end when I get to Ralph Natale and Allen's appearance in front of the United States Senate. And one of the most difficult things for a juror to decide is when someone's lying. I rest my case. Thank you for listening to Philly Trial Lawyer Stories. If you want to learn more about me or my cases, go to glennzeitz.com, GLENNZEITZ.com. If you want to support Philly Trial Lawyer Stories, please leave a review wherever you get your podcast, and make sure you tell your friends and family too. Philly Trial Lawyer Stories is hosted by Glenn Zeitz and produced by Studio D Podcast Production.